Imagine, for a moment, that you are not human. You are an alien historian observing Earth from a distance in the year 1860, calmly studying its civilizations the way one might study ants in a glass box. Your task is simple: predict which society will dominate the planet over the next 2 centuries. Your attention naturally settles on the giants. The British Empire stretches across nearly a quarter of the globe, its navy ruling the oceans, and its flag planted on every continent. France stands as a cultural and military powerhouse, refined and feared. Russia looms as a vast, untapped force, crude but immense, waiting to awaken. Then you notice the United States. At first glance, it barely deserves consideration. It is a young, fractured nation, still more farm than factory, tearing itself apart in what will become the bloodiest civil war in modern history. Half the country is burning, while the other half is trying to destroy it. Its currency is unstable, its financial system primitive, and its military insignificant when compared to European powers like Prussia. If you placed a bet on America in 1860, your alien bookmaker would laugh and take your money without hesitation. Now fast forward just 85 years. It is 1945. Europe lies in ruins, its cities reduced to ash and rubble. The British Empire is selling off its assets simply to feed its population. Japan has been annihilated, and the United States stands alone, untouched. Holding roughly half of the world's economic output, the majority of global gold reserves, and a navy larger than every other navy combined. This transformation defies common explanations. Textbooks credit freedom, democracy, and exceptional values. Those ideas sound comforting, but they are incomplete. The real story is colder, more strategic, and far more unsettling. It begins with geography that feels unfair, wealth accumulated while others bled, and a global system designed to tilt the board permanently in America's favor. This is not a fairy tale. This is the anatomy of an empire. Before discussing banks, wars, or politics, we have to talk about something far more fundamental: land and water. In every strategy game ever created, the starting position determines the outcome. Some players begin surrounded by enemies and mountains. Others spawn in a position so powerful it feels unfair. The United States began the game of history in the second category. Geographically, America is protected by what military strategists would call natural fortresses. To the east lies the Atlantic Ocean. To the west, the Pacific. These vast bodies of water function like enormous defensive moats, making any large-scale invasion of the mainland extraordinarily difficult. While European powers spent centuries fighting bloody wars over shared land borders, the United States developed in relative safety, free from the constant need to defend itself from neighboring rivals. But defense was only the beginning. The true advantage lay inside the continent itself. At the heart of the country sits the Mississippi River system, the largest connected network of navigable waterways on Earth. This was not merely a river. It was an economic superhighway. Thousands of miles of waterways allowed goods to move cheaply and efficiently long before modern highways or rail networks existed. A farmer in the American Midwest could ship crops to global markets for a fraction of the cost faced by farmers in Europe, Russia, or South America. Water transport created surplus wealth early, quietly, and consistently. Then there was the land. The American Midwest contains one of the largest continuous stretches of fertile farmland in the world. Add to this vast reserves of coal, iron, oil, and natural gas, all located within the same borders. Unlike other rising powers, the United States did not need to conquer distant territories to fuel its growth. Everything required for industrial dominance already existed at home. This advantage, however, came at a brutal cost. The land was not empty. It was seized through the violent displacement of Native American populations and war against Mexico. By 1900, the United States had achieved what strategists call strategic depth: secure borders, abundant resources, and internal trade routes that made sustained growth almost inevitable. The stage was set. All it needed now was a global crisis. In 1914, Europe made a catastrophic decision. A web of alliances, old grudges, and imperial arrogance dragged the continent into a war that would consume an entire generation. World War I is usually remembered for trenches, gas attacks, and shattered empires. But the real turning point in global power did not happen on the battlefield. It happened in accounting books. Before the war, the United States was not the financial center of the world. It was a debtor nation. American businesses and the federal government owed more money to European investors, particularly Britain and France, than they were owed in return. London, not New York, was the heart of global finance. The war changed everything. As Britain and France mobilized millions of soldiers, their factories shifted from consumer goods to weapons. Production collapsed. Supplies ran short. To survive, they needed food, steel, ammunition, and raw materials on an unprecedented scale. The only major industrial power capable of supplying them while remaining untouched by war was the United States. American exports exploded almost overnight. Factories roared back to life. Companies like DuPont transformed into industrial giants, supplying enormous portions of the Allies' explosives and ammunition. But soon, the European powers ran out of gold. War consumes wealth faster than it can be created, so they borrowed. Wall Street banks, led by J.P. Morgan, organized massive loans to Britain and France, effectively financing the Allied war effort. By the time the war ended in 1918, the financial balance of the world had flipped. Europe was drowning in debt, and the United States had become its creditor. America entered the war late, in 1917, after Europe had already exhausted itself. It arrived rich, fresh, and fully industrialized. When the fighting stopped, New York replaced London as the world's financial capital. The war left Europe broken and dependent, while the United States emerged wealthier than ever before. The torch of global power had quietly changed hands, even if few fully realized it at the time. But financial dominance alone was not enough. To rule the world, America still needed unmatched industrial and military strength. That would come soon enough. If World War I shifted financial power toward the United States, World War II transformed it into something far greater. This was the moment America stopped being merely wealthy and became overwhelmingly dominant. By 1941, the world was once again on fire. Nazi Germany controlled most of Europe. Japan was tearing through Asia and the Pacific. The United States, still recovering from the Great Depression, remained largely on the sidelines. Then came Pearl Harbor. Overnight, hesitation vanished. What followed was the most explosive industrial mobilization in human history. President Franklin D. Roosevelt set production targets so ambitious they seemed absurd. He demanded tens of thousands of aircraft each year, along with ships, tanks, weapons, and vehicles on a scale the world had never seen. Instead of failing, American industry exceeded every expectation. Automobile factories were converted into war plants. Entire cities became production hubs. One factory alone, Ford's Willow Run plant, stretched over a mile in length and produced a heavy bomber nearly every hour. By the end of the war, the United States had built hundreds of thousands of aircraft, tens of thousands of tanks, and millions of weapons. No other nation came close. Through the Lend-Lease program, the United States supplied its allies with massive quantities of equipment. Britain, the Soviet Union, and China all depended on American machinery, fuel, and logistics. This was not charity, it was strategy. While American factories worked without interruption, enemy and allied industries alike were bombed into ruin. When the war ended in 1945, the outcome was stark. Europe and Asia lay devastated. Their cities were destroyed, their economies shattered. The United States stood untouched, its industrial base intact, its economy booming. It controlled the majority of the world's gold reserves, produced most of its industrial output, and possessed the most powerful military on Earth, including a weapon no one else had, the atomic bomb. The world had been leveled. America emerged as the builder, the banker, and the enforcer of a new global order. While soldiers were still fighting across Europe in 1944, another battle was taking place far from the front lines. It was not fought with weapons, but with negotiations, leverage, and quiet threats. The location was a luxury hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. The prize was control of the global financial system. The United States invited 44 nations to decide how the world economy would function after the war. The outcome of the conflict was already clear. America held most of the world's gold, its industrial capacity was unmatched, and its homeland was untouched. It arrived at the table not as a participant, but as the dominant power. Britain sent John Maynard Keynes, the most influential economist of the era. He proposed a neutral global currency that would prevent any single nation from dominating international trade. It was a fair idea. It was also unrealistic. The United States rejected it outright. Instead, American negotiators imposed a system that placed the US dollar at the center of global finance. Under the Bretton Woods Agreement, the dollar was tied to gold at a fixed rate. Every other major currency was tied to the dollar. This effectively made the US dollar the world's reserve currency. The implications were enormous. To buy oil, machinery, or raw materials, nations needed dollars. To get dollars, they had to export goods or borrow from American-controlled institutions. The United States gained what later became known as an exorbitant privilege, the ability to print its own currency to purchase real goods from the rest of the world. To enforce this system, two institutions were created, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. Publicly, they were designed to stabilize economies. In practice, they ensured global dependence on the American-led financial order. The trap was set. The world was now locked into a system where prosperity flowed through Washington. But there was one problem. Europe was still in ruins, and a ruined continent cannot buy American goods. That problem would be solved next. By 1947, Europe was not just damaged, it was desperate. Cities lay in ruins, factories were silent, and food shortages pushed entire populations to the edge of starvation. In some regions, people survived on whatever they could find. This chaos created the perfect conditions for political upheaval. Communism was spreading. The Soviet Union looked west and saw opportunity. In countries like France and Italy, communist parties were gaining mass support. For the United States, this posed an existential threat. A communist Europe would mean the loss of critical markets, allies, and influence. The American-led financial system would collapse before it had even stabilized. Washington acted quickly. Secretary of State George Marshall proposed what became known as the Marshall Plan. Officially, it was framed as humanitarian aid, a generous effort to help Europe rebuild. The United States pledged billions of dollars to restore infrastructure, revive industry, and prevent famine. But this was not charity. The money came with conditions. European nations receiving aid were required to spend a large portion of it on American goods, machinery, and raw materials. U.S. tax dollars flowed out, only to return almost immediately to American corporations. The plan functioned as a massive stimulus for the U.S. economy, disguised as foreign assistance. More importantly, it purchased loyalty. By accepting Marshall Plan aid, Western European nations aligned themselves with American economic and political interests. Communist parties were sidelined, trade policies were coordinated. The continent was firmly anchored to Washington's orbit. The result was a permanent divide. Eastern Europe fell under Soviet control. Western Europe became an American economic partner and strategic buffer. The Iron Curtain descended, and the Cold War began. The Marshall Plan rebuilt Europe, but it also cemented American leadership. The United States was no longer just powerful, it was indispensable. However, maintaining this dominance required something else entirely, a permanent state of readiness for war. And that necessity would reshape the American economy forever. With World War II over, the world expected peace. What the United States faced instead was a dilemma. Its economy had been transformed into a war machine. Millions of jobs depended on weapons production, military contracts, and constant industrial output. If that machine suddenly stopped, the country risked sliding back into economic depression. A new enemy solved that problem. The Soviet Union emerged as a rival superpower, and fear of communism provided the justification for a permanent military buildup. In 1950, a classified policy document known as NSC 68 argued that the United States must maintain overwhelming military strength indefinitely. War, or the preparation for it, became a permanent feature of American life. This gave birth to what would later be called the military-industrial complex. The system was self-reinforcing. The military demanded advanced weapons, defense contractors demanded profitable government contracts, politicians demanded jobs and economic growth in their districts. Each group fed the others. Massive defense budgets became normal, even during peacetime. In 1961, President Dwight D. Eisenhower, a former general, issued a stark warning in his farewell address. He cautioned that unchecked military influence could distort democracy itself. Few listened, yet this system produced an unexpected outcome: innovation. To stay ahead of the Soviet Union, the US government poured enormous resources into research and development. Military needs drove technological breakthroughs that would later reshape civilian life. Early computer networks evolved into the internet. Missile guidance systems became GPS. Advances in microelectronics laid the foundation for modern computing. Silicon Valley did not emerge by accident. It was built on defense contracts and government-funded research. The technologies that now power smartphones, global communications, and digital economies were born from Cold War competition. America's dominance was no longer just military or financial. It was technological. The country learned how to turn fear into innovation and conflict into progress. But by the 1970s, this system faced a serious challenge. The dollar itself was becoming unstable. Once again, the rules of the game needed to change. By the late 1960s, the system that had made America dominant was quietly breaking. Under Bretton Woods, the US dollar was backed by gold at a fixed rate of $35 per ounce. Other currencies were pegged to the dollar, which meant global trust in money rested on one promise: the United States would always have enough gold to honor its obligations. It didn't. Decades of war spending, foreign aid, and expanding social programs flooded the world with dollars. Europe and Japan rebuilt, began running trade surpluses, and started asking an uncomfortable question: was the gold really there? Some nations stopped asking and started demanding. France, under President Charles de Gaulle, openly challenged American monetary power. French ships arrived in New York to exchange dollars for gold. Others prepared to follow. If the run continued, U.S. gold reserves would be drained. On August 15, 1971, President Richard Nixon made a decision that changed history. In a televised address, he temporarily suspended the dollar's convertibility into gold. The promise at the heart of Bretton Woods was broken overnight. No vote, no international agreement, just a unilateral decision. The world was shocked. Currencies began to float freely. Inflation surged. Trust in the dollar should have collapsed, but it didn't, because the United States engineered a replacement system just in time. That replacement was oil. In the early 1970s, Washington struck a series of quiet deals with Saudi Arabia and other OPEC nations in exchange for military protection and political support. Oil would be sold exclusively in US dollars. Any country that wanted energy, the lifeblood of modern civilization, first needed dollars. The gold standard was dead. The petrodollar was born. The dollar no longer needed gold backing. It was backed by global energy demand and American military power. The US could now print money, run deficits, and export inflation while the rest of the world absorbed the cost. This wasn't a collapse, it was a pivot, and it set the stage for a new era of financial dominance, one built not on restraint, but on leverage. Once the dollar was freed from gold, restraint disappeared. The Nixon Shock didn't just change monetary policy, it rewired incentives. The United States no longer needed to balance spending with hard assets. Deficits became manageable. Debt became a tool rather than a warning sign. And finance, not industry, began to dominate the economy. In the 1970s, inflation surged as oil shocks rippled through the system. To restore confidence, the Federal Reserve under Paul Volcker raised interest rates to historic levels in the early 1980s. The move crushed inflation, but it also rewarded lenders, punished borrowers, and shifted power toward capital. This marked the rise of modern financial dominance. Banks expanded aggressively. Wall Street grew more influential than factories or labor unions. Profits increasingly came from financial engineering rather than production. Money began to make money, detached from the real economy. Deregulation accelerated the trend. From the 1980s through the 1990s, restrictions built after the Great Depression were steadily dismantled. The repeal of Glass-Steagall blurred the line between commercial banking and speculative investment. Risk was no longer contained, it was distributed, repackaged, and sold. At the same time, the petrodollar system recycled global surpluses back into U.S. financial markets. Oil exporting nations deposited their dollar earnings into American banks, which then loaned that money worldwide. The United States became the center of the global debt machine. This system appeared stable until it wasn't. Debt exploded across households, corporations, and governments. Asset bubbles replaced organic growth. Financial crises became cyclical rather than exceptional, culminating in the crash of 2008 when the system nearly collapsed under its own complexity. Yet, the response revealed the truth. Banks were rescued. Losses were socialized. The dollar emerged stronger. Confidence was restored not through reform, but through bigger balance sheets, deeper debt, and more central bank intervention. The lesson was clear. The system would always protect itself, but every system built on leverage eventually meets its limits. And as the 21st century unfolds, the question is no longer how powerful this structure is, but how long it can last. So, where does all this leave the United States? America built an empire unlike any the world has ever seen. It started with geography, rivers, and fertile land. It rose through war, strategic finance, and industrial might. It leveraged technology, culture, and the dollar itself to dominate the globe. Yet for all its power, the empire rests on fragile foundations. First, debt. The national debt is astronomical, over $34 trillion today. Interest payments alone now exceed the entire defense budget. Imagine a country spending more to pay yesterday's bills than to defend tomorrow's borders. One sudden loss of confidence in the dollar could trigger chaos. Second, the global financial trap is unraveling. Sanctions, weaponized currencies, and unilateral policies have prompted countries like China, Russia, and Brazil to seek alternatives. The rise of BRICS nations and de-dollarization threatens the perpetual demand that keeps U.S. money printing safe. The empire can no longer assume the world will play by its rules. Third, internal division. The polarization within the United States mirrors the challenges of 1860. Political fragmentation, social unrest, and distrust in institutions weaken decision-making. A superpower can survive enemies abroad, but not if the crew mutinies from within. And yet, despite these threats, the United States remains dominant. Its military, its digital infrastructure, and its financial influence are unparalleled. But history reminds us that no empire lasts forever. Britain fell, Rome fell, and all great powers eventually confront limits to expansion. The American empire has played the long game brilliantly, buying the casino, writing the rules, and running the tables. But the future is uncertain. The real question today isn't how America became a superpower, it's what the world will look like when it no longer is. The next decade will test the limits of geography, money, innovation, and culture. Survival will require understanding, not just power, but fragility. History doesn't wait. Will the United States adapt, or will the empire crumble under its own weight?